Yeah.
So, great. I'm going to tilt this so I can see, which I think I can. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Great. So let's dive in a little bit into the material. And thank you all again for being here. It's a special kind of person who says, with the end of summer bearing down on them, that they're going to spend 3 hours talking about the Holocaust and genocide. It's a difficult subject, and it's not cheery, but it's so important to teach. And I'm very glad that this law was proposed and finally passed, and I think it's important and exciting for Connecticut students to know that Connecticut students will be exposed to this material. So our plan in terms of kind of presenting content, as it were, is to first talk about some of the terms that come up in Holocaust and genocide studies, because there can be a lot of confusion about this. Now, I may go a little quickly on this because just from hearing you all introduce yourselves, you're already there. In some sense, you're not the target audience for this part. You are. You know what the Holocaust is. You know what genocide is. But still, just to make sure that we're all starting at the same point, I think we'll go through this nonetheless. And then after a short break, I'll talk about Darfur, and I'll talk about the Rohingyas, a couple cases that just provide a little bit of context, talk about what's going on there, and perhaps a way one might think about teaching them. It's a little bit not my bailiwick, because I'm not actually in education, but there's certainly important themes that come out of both those cases. But we'll get there when we get there. So the first two slides that I would like to show are entitled, "What is the Holocaust and what is genocide?" So again, I'll be quick on this, but stop me, of course, if you have any questions or disagreements with the way I'm presenting something here. The Holocaust, in short, is the systematic persecution and murder of Jews in Europe by the Nazi regime during World War II. The Nazis also systematically persecuted and murdered other populations, including the Romani, or the Roma or Romani, or Sinti, more commonly known, although it's a pejorative term, as gypsies. That's a genocide. Some will lump all of that together under the umbrella of the Holocaust, but specifically, the most common usage, the Holocaust just refers to the persecution and murder of Jews. It's not to diminish that other genocides were happening at the same time, but rather sort of to hone in on the particular dynamics there. I think it's important to be aware of these other genocides and to, not just to be aware, make your students aware of them, and perhaps to think about the Holocaust in that context. Over the course of World War II, over 6 million Jews in Europe were murdered. In some countries, over 95% of the Jewish population was murdered. And in some countries, it may have been a little bit lower, but most of the rest saw fit to leave, as you might imagine. About half of those who were killed in extermination camps, Auschwitz among others. And to some extent, that's the iconic image, what people think about when they think about the Holocaust. If there's one sort of image in the mind, it's a barbed wire fence and perhaps an emaciated Jewish prisoner that, extrapolating further, is likely to be killed via gassing in a gas chamber. And it's a horrific image, a moving one, and certainly not inappropriate to think of the Holocaust that way. But it's also worth, two issues with that image, I suppose. One is that many of the camps were not extermination camps, but actually work camps or labor camps as well. So Dachau, for example, many people have visited. It's close to Munich. It's sort of gets more foot traffic than others. It was a labor camp, not a work camp. Even parts of Auschwitz were labor camps. So they weren't, at least in the first order, extermination camps. They weren't pleasant places to be by any stretch. But it's useful. I think it's important to be a little bit specific sometimes about, in thinking about the way that, and I'm jumping ahead of myself, but the way that Jews were imprisoned and then perhaps later killed, and some of the reasons behind that. The other half of that 6 million, roughly speaking, of that 6 million death toll was killed sort of in the field or without being concentrated, without the populations being concentrated. Some by the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units, essentially a van that would have some, I guess some had a sort of gas chamber in some right, but mostly it was SS police with guns. Many were not killed by the police, but many were. Tim Snyder at Yale and others have written about. Tim Snyder wrote a book called Bloodlands about the basically Western Ukraine and area around that, where the front of the war, the Russians and the Soviets and the Germans were just fighting in it, and the front would kind of move back and forth, and the tanks would come through in one direction, and as they did, local populations sought to sort of sort out old grievances, many of which were against, they were riled up against the Jewish population. So Jews would be killed by other civilians in that. And what's interesting about that is that it looks a lot more like more recent genocides. There really haven't been other genocides that have been dependent upon, at least specifically, a gas chamber. There's been concentration, but that is a kind of historical anomaly, a horrific anomaly. But it's always striking to me that many who were killed in the Holocaust were killed the same way that we see killing happening in other genocides. And then finally, I just want to mention that the Holocaust is not a single event. It's not. It didn't happen over in 1 month or particularly bad week. It was a multi-year process, and I think it's even worth extrapolating backwards before the actual process of killing started, which you can date at 1939 or 1941. I'm not actually a European historian or a Jewish historian. My focus my personal focus has been on Rwanda and genocide in Africa. So you may have more specific knowledge. Many of you may have more specific knowledge about the Holocaust than I do. But conceptually, I do think it's important to think about the Holocaust as something that began kind of in Nazi Germany, progressively, or probably regressively is a better phrase, with legalized discrimination in the 1930s against Jews and also against the Roma population. The concentration of those populations, at first in ghettos and then later in concentration camps. The conscious decision, apparently, 1941, early 1941, to pursue a so-called final solution, meaning the Nazi regime had contemplating deporting the entire Jewish population, perhaps creating a Jewish settlement in as far-flung places as Madagascar, but then decided instead to kill Europe's Jews rather than deport them. So at that point, then, the conversion of some concentration camps into extermination camps and the construction of others and the sort of whole infrastructure was put in place. And then over the course of 1941 and 1942, you see most of the murders of those 6 million people. questions or comments about this part of the definition? Okay, if not, I will move on to genocide. Genocide, simply speaking, is is any attempt to eradicate an identity group through the murder of its population. Now, perhaps that is even too wordy to be intuitive. I was giving a presentation to my son's 6th grade class earlier this year, and I asked this question, what is genocide? The kid raised his hand and said, it's mass killing of a group. And in some ways, that's exactly right. In like 6 words, or 4 words, 5 words, he managed to capture really the essence of it, of what we talk about. It's not just mass killing. It's mass killing of a group because of their membership in a group. But that can be explained after you say mass killing of a group. The term genocide didn't exist before the Holocaust. There is and many of you probably know of the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who, witnessing, sort of understanding what was going on, seeing the persecution of Jews in the 1930s. His own family was forced, and he lost most members of his extended family in the Holocaust. But he managed to move to the United States, where he worked as a lawyer at places like Duke University and Yale. He said, there should be what's going on. There should be a word for what's going on, because it's not just mass murder. It's not just mass persecution. And he thought, what's happening, what seems to be happening to the Jews of Europe before even the mass killing was taking place, reminded him of what happened to the Armenians in the late Ottoman Empire in 1915. And he said, it's this killing of a people. And so the geno and the side, it's actually a hybrid Latin-Greek word. So he, in an academic paper, a law review article of some sort, he made up this word, later published it in a book. And as with most academic papers and law review articles, no one really paid any attention to it until as World War II wound to a close and the concentration and extermination camps were discovered and liberated, and people realized that a large part of what had been going on in Europe was the Holocaust. It was this. I hope is something that you touch upon in your American history class when you're talking about the Holocaust and World War II. Is the amount of information that was available without action taking place. I think that sort of negative story, in a couple different senses, is an important part of the story. But at any rate, the UN was created, and one of the first things the UN did was sort of look back and say, look, we're created to prevent World War II from breaking out, but we're also created to, we need to sort of instill a human rights regime. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was underway, but even before that was presented to the General Assembly of the United Nations, the Genocide Convention was presented. And it was primarily based on one man, Raphael Lemkin's writings. And they said, oh, look, here's this guy who wrote a law review article, a book, academic book a couple years ago, and talked about genocide. Let's use that. In fact, Lemkin had been pounding the pavement in the halls of the UN for all of this time as well, so it's not a coincidence by any stretch. The UN came up with a much more complicated definition than the eradication of an identity group. And I've put it up here. There are, I think, 9, maybe 50. There's several clauses in the UN definition. Most of them, actually, the later clauses have to do with how you actuate or actualize, realize, how you put into place, institutionalize the the words of the convention, also how you can de-access from the convention. So they're procedurally actually really interesting, but they're not they're not what is genocide. They're not the gist of what is genocide. And the Genocide Convention is actually called the Convention for the Prevention and Prosecution of the Crime of Genocide, which is interesting itself, because most of it is actually enables prosecution, and it says very little about prevention. That's something I like to talk about with my students, have them read the Genocide Convention, and then say, okay, a genocide is underway. What does the Genocide Convention tell us should happen? And the answer is not very clear at all, but I think it makes for a good discussion. At any rate, what the UN Convention, the Genocide Convention, does do is give us a definition, and I think because genocide exists as a word primarily because of this convention, and because this becomes the legal definition internationally, and it has this sort of enduring, overarching power, it's a very useful definition to know. Before we get into one more thing about that, and going back to those other clauses, the Genocide Convention says that when you accede to the convention, you as a nation, need to introduce your own laws in your national legal framework that incorporate the definition of genocide and the crimes that are covered by it. Several countries, as they do this, actually incorporate broader definitions of genocide. So, and those are also legal definitions of genocide. It just happens to be the legal definition for the government or the state of Argentina, for example, as opposed to the UN definition. So you've seen it all here for 5 minutes now, but genocide consists of a number of acts, we'll get to those in a second, committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. It's actually relatively few, there's a lot packed into relatively few words, and although it is more concise than the sort of notional definition here, it still leaves a lot of room for arguing and challenges in applying the definition to any given case. For example, sort of the moving parts of really this refers to the definition are, well, what groups are, technically speaking, national, ethnical's not even a word we use anymore, racial or religious. Does that mean that, in Indonesia, where communists were persecuted and killed by the hundreds of thousands in 1965 and 66, does that mean, because it was mainly a political identity, that wasn't a genocide? By this definition and those facts, no, that wasn't a genocide. Given, though, that that within that population, a large portion of Indonesia's Chinese population was killed. Well, that's a national group. Some would argue in the Southeast Asian context, a racial group. These words are complicated when we start to unpack them. That does make it a genocide. So there's lots of room for argument. What actions? The covered acts include not just killing, but causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group. So perhaps a campaign of so-called ethnic cleansing, in which people are forced out of the country but not killed. That may be a matter of serious bodily or mental harm. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Perhaps what the UN body was thinking of was that the Germans in 1905 had in Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, had basically encircled, or done about 320 degrees of a circle, surrounding the Herero population in Southwest Africa, leaving an escape route into the completely inhospitable, unlivable desert. And something like 90% of the Herero population died at that point. A clear case of inflicting on the group conditions of life that were calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Imposing measures to prevent births within a group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, which is directly on point with the way that indigenous populations were treated in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. And each one of those countries, except perhaps the last, has had at least some reckoning with that process. And this, in each case, it's something that's happened within the last, say, 150 years. This is not ancient history. This is not 17th century stuff. This is at the earliest 19th century stuff. But there may be some room for debate. Are these too many actions? Are there other actions that should be considered criminal in this case? The scale is a question, in whole or in part. That doesn't mean that clearly a genocide is still a genocide if less than 100% of the population is killed. I was trying to figure out my negatives there, but so the reason for that language, I think, is simply to say the bar for declaring genocide is not total elimination of a group, but mass elimination of a large part, or an effort to eliminate a large part. This phrase "intent to destroy" is extraordinarily important in legal approaches to genocide, because in some cases where you've got meetings of Hitler and his associates deciding, yes, we'll pursue a final solution, there is clear intent to destroy. In Rwanda, where the radio issued proclamations that said, effectively, sometimes in coded language, but go out and kill the Tutsis, kill all of them, kill so they don't come back and kill us, kill even the children so they don't grow up to kill us. Intent to destroy is clear. In others, though, it may have to be inferred from actions. And there's an interesting debate that I won't get into now because I've probably gone on a little bit too long already, but between the difference between intent and motivation. Intent simply means doing an action on purpose that could be foreseen, that should have been foreseen to have some consequences. So, intent is, think of intent as doing something on purpose, not doing something for the reason of destroying. And that's actually a lower bar than a lot of people think for proving genocide. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other words that might be important or useful on the next slide. But are there any questions on this? Genocide definitions.
I think it's interesting, like the idea to use the word mental too. I mean, we always think of the bodily, but I always bring out to the kids like preventing births, or like when there's marriage laws or things, that's kind of leading to, like with the Hutu and the Tutsi, like that. I'm looking at the 10 stages of genocide, and I like for the kids to look at how it may not be intended to become a genocide, but like when you start classifying people and then, having them symbolize who they are and things, like it may not be the intention, but certain actions very easily lead to where it's full blown. Forcibly transferring children of a group to another group, separating parents from, the kids make connections, separating parents from children,
we see that going on today.
And and then the other thing, I had the UN thing that talks about how largely we think, like some of the excuses countries use is that it's a time of war.
Right.
So, I can do this, it's war, but the UN actually lays out that it doesn't matter. It can be a time of war or peace, it's
Right.
still genocide
Right.
when you do that. So sometimes governments will say they're just enemies of our government, but it's still genocide. So
Absolutely, yeah. I
all
mean,
of this stuff is.
Actually, that is a good segue for the next thing, because I'll talk a little bit about mass atrocities, which include war crimes. There's a specific set of laws. It's not laid out in the Genocide Convention. It's laid out I believe, in the Geneva Conventions, that say in a time of war you have to protect civilian populations. So targeting civilian populations even before the Genocide Convention was an international crime, and one of the first international crimes, to the extent that that's what the Geneva Convention really lays out for the first time. Geneva Conventions. But it could also be genocide as well, in part depending on how intentional the eradication is. In fact, well, let me go back and just maybe I can't go back. Oh yeah, I did.
Wait, that one?
That one, yes.
Oh,
Thanks.
there you go.
Just these two words, as such, are actually kind of important as well, even though it takes a while to figure out what they mean. As such, in my reading of it means that the goal is to eliminate the group as a group, not just to eliminate a lot of people who happen to be living in that area, no matter what their identity is, but it's targeting a, let's say, ethnic group because they are that ethnic group. And again, the intent part may sort of soften that higher bar, but that matters as well. Just quickly then, a little bit elements of terminology, and I think we'll hit upon this out of the mass atrocities part. Genocide has legal definitions and historical definitions, and genocide studies scholars like myself, actually I don't like to do this, but I was going to say they like to debate how to define genocide and how to categorize cases as genocide. I think genocide studies as a field kind of, I won't say debases itself, but spends far too much time on this issue, where we're kind of beholden to this definitional matter in ways that other fields or subfields or interdisciplinary fields are not. But there's a colleague of mine named Adam Jones who's written a textbook called Genocide, A Comprehensive Introduction. He spends about 20 pages in his introductory chapter discussing other scholars' definitions of genocide. And it's kind of interesting as an exercise, at least, to see the different ways in which different definitions can vary from one another. Still, so I think it's easiest to sort of have the technical legal definition in mind, and then to think of a sort of more notional, intuitive definition alongside of that. A Holocaust with a lowercase h can actually refer to any episode of mass death or death. It has come to be able to refer to any episode of mass death. I remember in the late 90s, it was common to say that the AIDS epidemic in Africa was an epidemiological holocaust. The extent of mass death that was going to come from AIDS was so large. But the Holocaust, with a capital H, refers specifically to the mass murder of Jews during World War II. And I think that's a useful definitional term to keep in mind. We have this word genocide to encompass other genocides. The Holocaust is I like to think of as a specific event, not in the sense of a discrete event, but a specific historical episode. Mass atrocities encompasses genocides as well as crimes against humanity, war crimes. Ethnic cleansing is actually something that the UN has never specifically defined, but it is presumed to be a mass atrocity to force people to leave some territory or to cross national boundaries in order to survive. There's a vibrant argument as to whether or not that constitutes genocide, perhaps because of the types of harm that it inflicts upon a group. and among other reasons. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the so-called 4 crimes: crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and I'm not sure, I think the 4th is crimes of aggression, which is one state invading another. It's only recently been officially added to the ICC's powers. But those, that group, those are the international crimes, international human rights violations, in a way, or a way of thinking about international human rights violations. And again, simply what's interesting, I think what a lot of students, I know a lot of college students don't realize coming in, is that what makes these crimes sort of special in a way is that one can be convicted or prosecuted by the international legal justice system, which opens up a whole can of worms about how complicated that is and how beholden to international politics international justice is. But that's different from ordinary, murder, shoplifting, bank robbery, financial scamming, all sorts of crimes, some of which may cross borders, but will be prosecuted in national courts. Now, the truth is, genocide could be prosecuted, should be prosecuted in a national court as well. As I mentioned, that's one of the things that the Genocide Convention calls for. But there is a legal sort of superstructure for the prosecution of genocide and other international crimes. Any questions about this? Yeah.
Could you just say the name of that book again and the author that you
Yeah,
mentioned?
Adam Jones, and I believe it's called Genocide, A Comprehensive Introduction. It's on its 3rd edition now in about 15 years, which is a pretty good revision and renewal rate. I think, I'll turn this one over to you then, and